Our final segment concerns evidence that the learning of 9-year-olds was reduced by the pandemic. Several news organizations reported on the recent release of the data for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, colloquially known as the nation's report card. The New York Times headline conveyed the news. The pandemic erased 2 decades of progress in math and reading. The report stated, quote, "The declines spanned almost all races and income levels and were markedly worse for the lowest performing students. While top performers in the 90th percentile showed a modest drop, 3 points in math, students in the bottom 10th percentile dropped by 12 points in math, 4 times the impact." The report went on to note that, quote, "In some parts of the country, the worst of the disruptions were short-lived, with schools reopening that fall. But in other areas, particularly in big cities with large populations of low-income students and students of color, schools remained closed for many months, and some did not fully reopen until last year." Sociologically, what are we to make of these patterns? For one, the assertion about urban schools seems to be incompletely connected to the evidence. When we look at the data, while we find math scores declining for urban, suburban, small town, and rural students, reading scores do not follow this pattern. Reading scores declined in suburbs, small towns, and rural areas, but reading scores were stable for urban students. The math scores are of course concerning for all communities, but it is interesting that the communities that sustained their reading scores were urban ones, despite remote instruction and other challenges. A fact so unexpected that the New York Times report fails to notice it. Ideally, that fact would be noted and interrogated. How were urban students able to sustain their reading performance while their suburban, small town, and rural peers did not? There might be important lessons from such an investigation that could help everyone. Stepping back, the fallout from COVID should clarify some matters. COVID provided what social scientists often call a natural experiment. That is, some disruption occurred that allows us to gain insight into how things are under 2 different sets of conditions. The assumption for this natural experiment is that students who were 9-year-olds in fall 2022 had a different kind of educational experience than did students who were 9 in fall 2020. The older students had all of their schooling before age 9 in person, while the younger students had much of their schooling either remotely or not at all. So, the data can suggest whether in-person schooling or a combination of remote schooling and no schooling leads to more learning. It seems that in-person schooling with the current set of teachers is better, at least for youngsters. I imagine many of you hearing this conclusion might be thinking, "Thank you, Captain Obvious." But the lesson is not so obvious, at least if you look at the last 30 years of attacks on schools and proposed reforms. In the early 2000s, we introduced tests to evaluate schools, with punishments and closures to follow if they did not measure up. States passed legislation allowing or mandating charter schools, and their numbers have grown. But the attack on schools and teachers continues. During a January 2021 episode, Fox News host Jesse Waters said about striking Chicago teachers, quote, "I don't think these teachers are even smart enough to be in the classroom." And co-host Greg Gutfeld followed up with, quote, "It's time to pull the money out of the systems. Start backing the parents. Give them the money so they can make the choices for the best education, whether it's school choice, homeschooling, the Peloton model," unquote. Some so strongly doubt teachers' confidence, we now have directives that ban not only books, not only certain words, but just the possibility that a student may end up feeling bad at the end of a unit. These are not the interventions you would expect someone to propose if they believed the institution employed competent and well-meaning personnel. So when we look at the nation's report card, and see declining performance during the period of COVID lockdowns. We should also see that despite insufficient budgets, aging infrastructure, low monetary pay, and low psychic pay in the form of continuing disrespect, the schools we now have must have been doing something right. Because when we conducted the natural experiment of reducing students' access to the schools we have, we reduced their learning. The result is a sad one, but if we understand its meaning, we can perhaps stop attacking teachers in schools, because that's what we will need to do to have a chance to help those students get back on track, help new students stay on track, and have an education system that attracts and retains the teachers we need if we are to have any hope of accomplishing those clearly important goals and more. That's This Week in Sociological Perspective. We'll be back next week with another interview with an author of some important sociological research and more sociological insights on an issue in the news. Till then, take care. If you're watching this on YouTube, I have 3 brief requests to make and 1 offer to extend. My requests: if you find the show or episode interesting, please like, subscribe, and comment. My offer: if you want to receive no more than 1 email a week with a link to the new TWiSP episode, click the link in the description and then enter your email address. By doing this, you are sure you will be notified no more than once a week about new TWiSP episodes. Thanks. I appreciate it.